So I'm Lois Donnelly, interviewing Susie Orbach on the 15th of June 2022 over Zoom, and we're discussing their life and career in the context of feminism and its history within psychology. So first of all then, could you just tell me a little bit about yourself? So maybe in terms of, the trajectory of your career and the topics of your work and that kind of thing.
Well, I don't really think of it as a career. And I think maybe that's because I'm a sort of pre-modern figure in the terms of today's vocabulary. And therefore, you're going to have to ask me questions rather than me being able to give you an account. I became interested in psychology, the mind, the body, how we're constituted, how we come to be who we are, through, most intensely, I suppose, through feminism, and trying to understand the structures inside of us that incline us to not act in our own best interest. So while fighting for equality, and this, when I came into feminism, it was second wave feminism, so it was on the heels of the civil rights movement and Black Power and the struggle to get America to leave Vietnam. So feminism came out of these very vibrant, huge social struggles. And I was part of the first women's studies program that existed in the world, and as a student, and began teaching in it immediately because that's how open it was. And what I noticed about everybody who was there, and it was in a working class community college, was our own hesitations about taking up power or taking up our positions, or feeling we all had to move in step at the same time, or being threatened by structures of competition or envy or jealousy, or not being able to say when one was hurt or misunderstood. So I think that's what got me into thinking, well, actually, patriarchy isn't just outside there in structures in how we're brought up in terms of schooling, etc. It actually makes the mind. That girls and boys have to, as we had those categories then, have to accommodate to the ways in which their lives, their thoughts, their imaginations, their longings, their desires are structured both by their class position, their geography, their gender, their race, and their general background. And that led me to sort of looking at being very interested in, okay, well, who studies subjectivity, how you become a subject. So that led me to being interested in psychoanalysis, but not for its sort of crude, as it had become at that point, theory on women or practice towards women, but about the idea that what you're understanding is a human subject.
Yes.
So that's where I suppose turns out to have been a long-term interest, right? We're now 50 years later, more even, and I'm still really interested in how we get minds, how we get bodies, why we think the way we do, what makes change possible, what it's like to be a clinician where you're watching change as it happens, and looking at it as a kind of potential research tool. I don't know if is that good enough as an opener?
Yeah, no, that's lovely. And sort of going back to that kind of feminism then, can you recall kind of when that identity or interest in feminism kind of started? Well,
it was the early 70s, very early 70s. I didn't quite understand what feminism was, because I think for many women of my generation, it we thought that things like talking about babies was kind of less than. So it took feminism to think about, wait, we're interested in everything. We're interested in the making of human beings, and the making of bonds, and how they happen, and why wars, you know, so it was very early 70s. And I should say that my best friends were made at that time. And we're still in daily contact, even though we're on different continents.
Brilliant. Amazing. Yeah, so was it kind of mainly once you got to start on that women's studies that kind of came into your work, or was it before that?
Well, I think what happened was that there was women's studies. I'd done lots of other things before, but I suppose, you know, I've looked at let's talk about women in the law, let's talk about women in film, let's talk about women in literature, women in history, women in science, let's talk about women's bodies, let's talk about, and so I had a lot of interests, some of which I've worked around. And I was really, one of the things about feminism is that it wasn't principally organized in universities, it was just mushrooming everywhere. And I went to a thing called the Alternate U in New York, where I was living at the time. And there were courses on everything, which you could just go to, or you could just teach. So there were ones on Marxism and feminism, or consumerism, I guess, or Marcuse or whatever. And then there was one on women's bodies, and I joined that, and together we began to look at, the group, why women were tortured in their bodies, what was going on with the food industry, with iconography, with the women as represented as either Madonnas or whores, how we'd taken that on for ourselves, how we were never okay. And I thought it was a kind of limited, small interest, but it turned into a very big interest. I mean, not my dominant interest, in the sense that I've written widely, very, very widely, and not just about women's bodies and women's minds and their relationship to each other, but it grabbed me enough to think I should become a therapist. And so that's what happened. I became a therapist.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. So was that was that your first kind of attraction to psychology as a discipline, would you say, then, at that
Well, I mean, it was quite interesting because I wasn't drawn. I thought about doing a PhD in psychology, but in those days, the programs weren't exactly what I wanted. They were too conventional.
Yeah.
And so were most of the programs around. So, but I suppose it was. I mean, obviously, if you read literature, you're interested in people, right? So, but I might have been more sociological, if you like, rather than on the side of psychology. But I did find, and we started a feminist therapist training group, and we all, a bunch of us trained together, or almost simultaneously, and we began to look at what people had said about women, both the papers that were classics and ones that weren't. And I should say that at the Women's Studies program, one of the lecturers was Phyllis Chesler, who'd written about women.
Right. Yeah.
And so she was a window into the psychology. But yes, I guess that was the beginning of it. But we were so interested in ourselves, and we were in therapy, and we were in self-help groups, and we were in everything. So the whole thing just became an intense, I guess, like any scientist who's caught up in their work, you're in the lab all the time, really.
Yeah.
you're examining everything, you're thinking everything, you're trying to accumulate knowledge. And in the process, of course, you're actively and passively being transformed.
Yeah, absolutely. And so who were those people that you trained with then? And are you still in touch with any of them?
Yeah. I mean, the two of them were my best friends, but the people that, yeah. I mean, I went to Stony Brook to the Health Sciences Centre. They had a fantastic modern program. And out of that came several people who were associated with the Women's Therapy Centre Institute in New York. So it was a
Brilliant. Yes.
But we didn't really have forefathers or foremothers. I think that's the thing. We had to, because it was such a new movement, although there were papers that we could read, and there was a particularly important collection for me, which was Jean Strauss's Women in Psychoanalysis, which was a collection of papers. And there was Frantz Fanon writing about how racism was internalized. So it would be black skin, white masks. And it was, I mean, it was, how do you translate those things? So I think really we were, like many of our generation, kind of self-invented. I mean, collectively self-invented, rather than having mentorship. Although in time, places that would not have regarded what we were doing as kind of kosher and okay, then came to learn from the Women's Therapy Centre, but that took a while to happen.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So kind of creating things with your peers in a way, and kind of creating that from nothing. Yeah, that's so interesting. So so as you were saying, that kind of feminism was almost in the air at that time.
It's what we breathed.
Yeah. And so how did that come together with your work? Was that very kind of natural in that sense, or
yeah, because I think because we were starting from ground zero, if you like, we were like, okay, how interesting that we have contempt for conversations about mothers and babies. I mean, I'm just trying to draw a link to what I said before.
Yes.
When mothers and babies, given that most mothers most women do parenting, or did in those days, what is that? What is that relationship? What is the parental or the mother figure doing? So what is mothering as a psychological and sociological attachment? What is that relationship doing? And the creation of both the mother, but also the developing baby and child. So it came together that way. It's like, well, the mother is not really considered much of a subject. She's the baby's object, or the adult's object, or the failing object, if you like, or the one who's got it wrong. But what about her own development? What's happened to that? So it was not a conflict. It was very much, whereas the next generation who studied straight psychoanalysis or psychology and then had to fold back in and couldn't quite get there with feminism and patriarchy, because they had a whole other structure going on in their head, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the book that Louise and I wrote, called Understanding Women, which was towards a new I can't remember the subtitle, but anyway, isn't that appalling? Was about trying to look at this very structure of how does a baby develop into a girl, a woman, and then what happens in the therapy, in a woman-to-woman therapy. So that was our first contribution, really.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I was just wondering how you might describe kind of what psychoanalysis was like, as you're talking about kind of maybe the conventional type.
Oh, the conventional psychoanalysis. I mean, when I go to the Tavistock, for example, for a seminar. This is probably after Fifi, Fat as a Feminist Issue, was published, and I went, and I was invited to go, and I'd listen in to the interpretations that were given. I was just flabbergasted, because it wasn't that the Tavistock had above its door, this place discriminates against women. It didn't say that. But every interpretation was about the woman needs too much, she's too clingy, she's overly dependent, she needs to separate. And that for me was an absolutely fascinating example of conventional psychoanalysis, which had designated a woman's needs as being dangerous, rather than a feminist interpretation, which is, well, why are her needs so dangerous? Is it because then she isn't allowed to recognize them? They're not met. She has to live with unmet needs, and therefore they come out in very unhappy ways. Looks like she has an overcommitment to being dependent, but actually maybe it's because her dependency needs are not in the frame, and she's always providing that for everybody else. So conventional psychoanalysis would talk about empty nest syndrome as this shameful thing, as though a woman's life was over, or women's depression. It was the time of Brown study, so there was quite a lot about social depression in women coming up, which was not in psychoanalysis but in psychology.
Right, yeah.
And it was very interesting that I remember at the Women's Therapy Center, there was a woman who came out of the local, I guess, mental hospital. And she said, oh, it was lovely there. I was looked after. It was warm. I was fed. I didn't have to look after everybody else. Now, that's a really interesting insight into women's experience of finding their identity through giving to others all the time, and then being scolded by psychoanalysis, if you like, for being overgiving because you want something in return, and feeling so empty and hungry and lost inside of yourself.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I bet they're still teaching bits of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure it's changed a lot, but maybe not enough. Yes. So then you kind of started, so you were saying that was kind of early 1970s.
Well, we started the Women's Therapy Center in 76.
Yes. So I'll just come back to kind of, well, no, maybe I'll touch on that now, actually. So obviously you founded that. So maybe
I founded it with Louise Eichenbaum, who I think maybe has also been interviewed for this. I'm not sure.
Yeah, she has. Yeah, she's already been interviewed, and yeah, it's a great one. So do you want to maybe tell me a bit about kind of how that started? And
you know, I don't even think it's that interesting. It was, we came to England. I'm English.
Yeah.
We were we thought, because Juliet Mitchell had written Psychoanalysis and Women, we thought, oh, there'd be a really big therapy scene here. There wasn't.
Interesting.
And there were things called red therapy that were really interesting. There were various voluntary initiatives, but there were, you know, therapy was kind of behind a closed door, and God knows how you'd find it. And so we just said, okay, let's start a women's therapy center. We didn't know what we were doing. We had no funding. We had a couple of rooms in my basement, because I bought a house at that point, or at least the bank had, you know, helped me buy a house.
Yeah.
And we made a leaflet, and within 2 weeks, we were flooded with people wanting to come for therapy.
Gosh.
And we had to ask other women to join us. So that was Margaret Green and Sally Berry, both of whom I'm still very close to. And it mushroomed from then. And we had, I think what was really important about what we did, apart from being open access, was actually, it was the day of the telephone, and we would answer the phones. And from that, we would know what people wanted. You know, it wasn't like at that point we had an administrator we would like, okay, I don't know how to have an orgasm, and I want a women's group to help me with that. Or I don't know if I'm, I've come from Belfast, and I think I'm a lesbian, and I don't, you just, or I've had a baby, but I'm not sure. I think it might have been, from somebody in the family. So there were all those kinds of things. So immediately our perspective was just so opened up. It wasn't like you have to apply to a therapy center and you have to, it's just raw need and desire, I guess, at that point, which we could respond to up to a point.
Yeah. So did that become too much at any point?
Well, I think it did, because we were youngsters and we didn't know what we were doing, but it was fine. It was lovely. I mean, we were very exhausted, whereas Louise and I were willing to go and talk all wherever we were asked to speak, the other people who joined us were not eager to do that.
Right.
And, as it grew, obviously we had meetings to try to get other people to do that. But more, I think what was really more important, what was sustaining and stopped the exhaustion, was that we had two, all of which we've written about, I think, in Understanding Women, but we had two groups for ourselves, that the people who worked at the therapy center. One was to discuss themes that were coming up in the work. And the way we would discuss them would be through personal experience, as well as through what we were hearing clinically. So that was one group, once a week, that everybody attended. So 6, 8, 10 of us, however many there were, 12 of us. And then the other group was the other staff time was a group supervision. Again, everybody had to attend, in which we could present the people we were working with, but we had to go through doing it by our own, we talk about them, but then we had to talk about our own identification with that person. How we saw ourselves in them. So that we kept very clearly in our minds that these were not objects to be worked on or interpreted, but these were women like us in the process of evolving. Not that that's be something we'd be sharing in our sessions, but we would be thinking about that and the kind of impact that the women we were seeing had on us. And the countertransference that it evoked in us, or if it didn't, so it was separate to the normal supervision that we had. It was a collective reflection on how it was affecting us. So I think that those were two really important things in our development and in the strength of the center.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds really important and interesting within that work. And so is that what you reflected on a lot in Understanding Women?
Yes, absolutely. And yes, I suppose we did. Yeah. But I still think about it. I mean, I've been working on my own for years since, but I still find the ideas from then really important.
Yeah.
When I get together with Louise Eichenbaum and Carol Bloom, who I co-founded the Women's Therapy Center Institute with in New York, and the other people who are there, we will still talk about all these issues, obviously. I mean, not these issues from then, the issues as we see them today, because we're aging women now. So that doesn't mean we don't see people across the age spectrum, but we have a different take on things, obviously.
Yeah. So yeah, understanding that experience is part of the work, and
we've changed as therapists, because I think we never wanted to be. We wanted to have our boundaries, but we didn't want to be cold, removed therapists who didn't say where they were going on holiday, for example. So that was the only thing you could talk about, was being withheld. I mean, I just don't believe in that stuff. I believe being absolutely present in the session as much as you can be. and then the session closes and that's that. And then you have, so I think we took our ways of practice not entirely from the domain that we were coming from, if you like.
Yes, absolutely. And so, yeah, I suppose was it those kind of things that maybe make therapy feminist for you, or what might make therapy feminist as opposed to not feminist?
Well, everything we took up, every issue we took up, we would take up with we wouldn't be hearing it in probably the way that a regular therapist would. I mean, when a woman talked about feeling she didn't know who she was if she was in a relationship, but then she didn't know who she was without one, or she did know who she was without one, those were feminist concerns in terms of, I mean, we wouldn't label it as feminist.
Yeah.
Because you don't do propaganda in a therapy session. That's not what you're doing. You're listening. But you're thinking about, well, what is it that makes it possible for her to feel she exists in one way in this way, but not in another? And so analytically, I'd be thinking about that in terms of the structure of a feminized mind and defense structure. So it's it's not, I could take any session and analyze it, if you like, from that perspective. I could also analyze it from other perspectives. So I don't think I don't know how to answer your question really, because that's just who I am. It's just integrated into me. It's not like oh, let's put feminism on top of this. It was inside of it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Absolutely. Great. So then you, as you mentioned, you moved to New York and kind of started another training institute over there.
Well, yeah, it was just a training institute because there's loads of therapists in New York. And we didn't see the need to open a therapy center, but we did think we needed to inject something that was feminist and relational into, and particularly coming from British object relations, which seemed to us, to offer something about the internal world that was useful. And I'm talking about the work of Fairburn and Guntrip and at this point. And so we started off really quite modestly with a lecture series at the New York Academy of Sciences, where we invited people to give talks and gave talks ourselves. And like Harriet Lerner, for example, who was at Topeka, at Kansas, at the Menninger, or I mean, people came from all over North America, and we did that for an audience of whoever wanted to come. And then out of that, we did short groups for women to train to understand how to work with women in therapy, and then how to work with women in their bodies, etc. And so a whole set of developments happened. And I mean, I then returned to England. So that was left for Louise and Carol to join with other people. I mean, I kept going back, but not that I had children at that point. So at that point, I was really working privately, which was a shame for me, but it was what I could manage if I wanted to have family.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's a really interesting distinction between kind of Britain and the US in terms of therapy and stuff like that. Was that strange?
I guess it was strange, and I mean, I'm sure it was strange, and I didn't know if I was staying here, I was going. I mean, the whole thing was strange.
Yeah.
And it's been strange to, I mean, I wrote Hunger Strike, I guess, when I was pregnant, about anorexia as a metaphor for our time. And I guess I was really surprised that it's, that ideas like that we had we were just continually pumping them into the public domain, if you like.
Yeah.
And people were like, oh, this is really interesting. This is really, I don't know. It was like therapeutic thinking was not in the public domain then. So, but it was people were interested in it.
Yeah.
And, you know, we were working on things like that have come round again, like how to have saner jobs, you know, how not to work, how to have what is now called a work-life balance, how to raise children who are emotionally literate, all the kind of things that are, you know, on the agenda now.
Yeah, yeah. It's don't know if it's odd that it's still talking about those things many years later. But yes,
with a different inflection, obviously, but nevertheless, yes.
Yeah. And so, did you feel ever kind of any tension between kind of that conventional psychoanalysis approach and your more feminist one?
Only if I went to conferences and, you know, I mean, if I was invited to speak or go to a conference and people would suddenly, you know, give you a case and they would interpret it. And I think, no, I don't agree with that.
Okay. Yeah.
No, I don't. That's not what I would think if that woman was sitting in the room with me. I would not be thinking that, or that man was sitting. So I'd feel tension then and very passionate about it. But there were loads of, you know, attempts to get, particularly in relational psychoanalysis, to get feminism in. And some of the women who used to come to the talks that we gave, you know, became part of the relational community in North America. And I mean, it was, I think it was a very, yes, of course there was tension with people, but I always feel intellectual tension is an interesting moment. It's not something that I'm always curious about, how and why we think the things we think. And, you know, if I hear something on attachment theory, or I hear something on the Oedipus complex or those kind of things, I'm always thinking, well, how do we understand that? How do I understand that? What's the texture of that makes sense to me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Rather than, oh, that's a great idea, let's take that on board. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Great. So yeah, in terms of the kind of particular pieces of your work then, I was wondering if there was any one particular accomplishment or something that you were really proud of, that you were kind of most proud of. No? Nothing comes to mind.
No, I mean, I could read something I wrote, you know, during COVID for The Guardian and think, oh, that's really good. Gosh, I wrote that. Or I could think that about, I'm still interested in everything. So I don't know how to pick something out. You know, there's no point in my saying, well, I think Between Women was really important, because yes, it's important, but I wouldn't.
Yeah, that's fine. So in terms of, I was kind of thinking about some kind of areas of your work, and I was thinking that, you know, as you touched on before, some of your work was around kind of bodies and disordered eating. And I was just wondering, you know, one of your earliest books was Fat as a Feminist Issue. And I was wondering how that work kind of developed, how it started and how it developed maybe throughout kind of your later books around similar topics.
Well, I think how it developed is that I then wrote Hunger Strike. I then wrote On Eating, which was a sort of distillation of the practice of it rather than the theories behind it. And then I wrote Bodies, which I basically rewrote a few years ago, because I began to see very profoundly that although bodies are you know, I think the theory in Fifi is you have eating problems, or you have fat or thin as ideas, because you're dealing with distress in the mind and it's being expressed in the body. I think what Bodies does is take the thesis and turns it upside down and says, mothers are now, because of their own history of eating, and the kind of pressures on them from the culture to be a certain way, that the bodies they bring to parenting at the most intimate level, from the fact that, you know, they're exercising, you know, from the minute they've had a baby. I'm being crude, but the whole emphasis or the world position on moving towards cesareans and all of this kind of thing is actually making the body a site of such distress that the body itself that the mother is bringing to the infant is a body that may be quite troubled. And so the origins of troubled bodies come from that very early relationship, whereas I would have said in Fifi, the origins of troubled minds come from that, whereas now I would say body difficulties are trumping troubled minds in a way, and making troubled minds. And so I think that's how it's evolved. And Bodies is really a book which tries to look at the way bodies are made and that how they've become an actual production for women and for men, but mainly for women, and how bodies are the site of, continue to be the site of personal assault, but also of assault in war, and rape as a weapon of war, and how therefore bodies are deeply insecure for women. That if you grow up with an insecure body, it's very hard to get beyond it. And an eating problem or a cutting problem is the response to that basic not feeling you have a body that is stable. So I think the work's developed that way, and I'm pretty proud of Bodies as a book. I like it a lot. I like the things it explores.
Yeah.
And I'm still interested because I think every day, I mean, I can read, you know, whether I read about the pollution that's caused by the industries that clothe us, right? The environmental degradation that comes as a result of of fast fashion or luxury fashion. It doesn't have, you know, or what it means, what it means to that those are such huge industries now. They're not small, you know, they're absolutely ginormous. There are, you go into Selfridges and it continues to expand its makeup department, you know, so that tiny tots have makeup ranges to old ladies who are supposed to fix our bodies until we're, I mean, you know, it's, and the way that cosmetic surgery apps are targeted at little girls so that they learn to remake their bodies as though they are totally malleable and not something you live from. So that's how the work's developed. It continues to intrigue me, interest me, enrage me.
Yes, yeah. And and how do you think that shift has happened then from the first kind of theorizing to the one in Bodies?
Well, I think it's been I think what's happened is that it's so profitable to make women feel bad about their bodies that let's make older women and younger women and girls and boys and men. And I just think it's an industry in which you can come at it every angle and make money, whether it's in the food industry, whether it's in the diet industry, which is of course part of the food industry, whether it's in the so-called health industry where you sell remedies, whether it's in the cutting up your body part of industry. I mean, and as I've said, the fashion industry. So I think it's being able to see what's happening in the economy, looking at economic figures to see the growth of certain industries and tie those to people's experience that's been important for me as a theorist. Doesn't mean I sit in a session and say, well, you know, the reason you feel this is because, I mean, I'm just not like that.
Yeah.
I'm dealing with people's anguish and distress and pain and sorrows and angers and grief and despair in sessions. I'm not dealing, as I said, I'm not telling them, well, you know.
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of separation, I suppose, between those two areas.
Yes, but they're two different things. And I think the only reason that I write is that you learn so much in the consulting room.
Yeah.
That is so precious and valuable, interesting, that I wanted to share it in a wider way and contextualize it in a wider way.
Yes.
So that's, I think, how I deal with the differences. That makes sense.
Yeah, and suppose you see patterns from the things that you talk about with clients that then you can apply to patterns that are happening more kind of at a societal level and at an economic level and those kind of things, as you were saying. Yeah, okay. So I also wanted to touch on some of the work that you've done as kind of consultants for various organisations. So I know you were involved with the Dove campaign for Real Beauty. And I was just wondering if we could talk a little bit about kind of what those kind of projects are like.
Well, that came about because I was really fed up with going to government all the time, trying to persuade them that actually women's bodies matter, women's minds matter. You know, the first 1,000 days matter, everything, all to do with that, and not really getting anywhere until the coalition government came in, because they had two feminist ministers, Lynn Featherstone and she ran the party at the end. I'll think of her name in a minute. Anyway, and I was so fed up with governments. They had summits, which I was a keynote at, on women's bodies, but they didn't follow through on anything. And I kept thinking, if I could only get to a progressive advertising company or a company that makes women's beauty products, I could say to them, why don't you do this? It'll, you know, it would be a good message. As it was, somebody who was the sort of top honcho at the advertising agency for Dove came to me and said, is it true that advertising oppresses women? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, yes. And how do they do it? And I said, well, why don't you go make a little film and ask their lovely daughters, all the lovely daughters of your chief executives or whatever, how they feel about their bodies, and then go show it to Unilever.
Gosh.
And they showed it to Unilever, and Unilever agreed. And there was a woman at the head of the brand, and Sylvia Lagnado, I think, Lagnado, and Mel at Ogilvy, and they presented this film and said, Dove, which is not exactly a beauty company, but is sort of was a beauty, you know, it's not a like cosmetic company. We could make a difference. And they got a lot of money from Unilever to try to remake the whole outlook of the brand. And that's how I got involved.
Oh.
So they did a tremendous amount of this, as well as all the ads, which, you know, I was saying, if you show a variety of bodies and of women engaged, and they're not always looking to camera, and they're not always, I mean, there's so much I could talk about in terms of that, but we don't really have enough time. But it was also the work they did behind the scenes with workshops for girls, which Girl Guides did throughout the world, to try to change girls' experience of engagement and confidence, and being able to find other ways to express themselves than through transforming their bodies. So that was a very long project.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine. A lot to do.
And now I look at ads for all sorts of things and I say, oh, they've got big women and dark women and light women. And so it did work. It didn't stop women being preoccupied with their bodies, however, because people are still being sold stuff.
Yes. Yeah, that's really interesting. So yeah, even in my lifetime, I've noticed such a change with advertisements and stuff. but yeah, it's interesting how that maybe doesn't, yeah, as you say, stop people being preoccupied.
No, I mean, you need something you need to help, one of the big initiatives I've worked on and has never happened is, it's Jo Swinson, who was the minister, as well as Lynn Featherstone. Yeah. I produced with my colleague, Holly Rubin, a government paper, which is about how to train midwives and health visitors to help mums, expectant mums, with their own body eating problems, so they don't pass it on to the next generation. So that was a paper called Two for the Price of One. I have never been able to get that program in anywhere. And it's just a training program for midwives, so they feel more confident instead of just putting mothers on weighing machines and telling them not to go to be obese. I mean, which is just completely crazy. It doesn't do anything. It just adds to, I mean, we did some training at NCT, and the preoccupation of the mothers of the people that NCT counselors were working with were just desperate to get back into their genes immediately after their baby, rather than actually this is a period when you need to surrender to your body, because actually you're learning how to be in a postpartum body with your baby, etc., etc. So I mean, I continue to be frustrated, let me put it that way, because you can't just do the advertising. You need to do it at the infant mother level, at the preschool level, and at the school level. And things like the BMI are such a disaster. They just pathologize the whole situation.
Yeah. Yes, there needs to be more practical things happening at societal level as well.
And also teachers, most teachers are messed up about their bodies. They're just projecting that all the time too.
Yeah.
So, it's a big work, and it's never going to be done, unfortunately.
Okay, great. So switching gears a little bit then, I wanted to talk a bit more about your involvement with kind of feminist activism throughout your life, and what you've been involved with, if anything.
Gosh, I don't know. I know that I was part of a group against sexual harassment. That was probably in the very early 80s.
That's interesting.
Where some of us, I was a therapist, a couple of people, trade union people. I mean, the lawyers, etc. Then I was, I was involved for many years with a group called Endangered Bodies / Anybody. So where we looked at and tried to produce material that we thought was useful for kids and for schools, and had loads of demonstrations and gave evidence in Parliament, etc., etc. So there's loads of things that I've done out of activism. Now I'm just, an old lady, really.
Not at all, not at all. Brilliant. Yeah, okay, so you're also part of the British Psychological Society, is that correct?
No.
Okay. Have you ever been sorry?
I've been invited to give talks.
Yeah.
I know I'm part of the British Psychoanalytic Council. Yeah.
Okay. Have you ever been involved with the Psychology of Women and Equality section of the BPS?
Sadly not.
No. Okay, lovely, thank you.
I mean, I've probably been to a meeting 100 years ago, but not.
Yeah, nothing comes to mind about.
Well, I think I've addressed certain meetings of it, but I don't know. I haven't been involved as a because I'm not a psychologist by training.
Yes. Yeah, of course. Okay. Have you been involved with any other kind of feminist organizations then, in kind of maybe there are sections of the Psychoanalytic Council or something that, or any other kind of feminist but academic or therapy
Not
related?
formally, no, not formally. I mean, anybody took up a lot of time,
Yeah.
right? And the
Yeah,
practice, and no. Well, apart from that, no.
that's
I
fine.
mean, I'm also a writer, so yeah, no.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot always going on, things to balance. Lovely. So I suppose I wanted to ask a bit more broadly in terms of feminism and psychoanalysis. What do you think, what impact do you think feminism has had then on psychoanalysis and therapy?
Well, I think it's humanized it hugely.
Mm,
It's made it much more relational.
yeah.
It's depathologized the fact that you might actually care for and be on the side of your patient's clients while you're holding the position of being the therapist.
Yeah.
I think it's brought issues of vulnerability as a progressive idea,
Mm,
of dependency as something that's inevitable and is human, of the difficulties of change. I think it's had a huge unrecognized impact. In fact, Louise and I wrote a paper about that many years ago, the unrecognized contribution of feminism to psychoanalysis,
oh,
which we gave at a UN sponsored or a UNESCO sponsored conference in Peru. So I think that it is unrecognized, but it is nevertheless huge.
mm,
And it's within couple work where you look at the couple differently, particularly heterosexual couples, or you look at gay couples. I mean, I think it's absolutely huge. And if I had lots of time, I'd be writing more about it, but I don't.
yeah, yeah. And do you think there's more to go? Do you think there could be kind of other things that could change about that?
Well, it could be, yeah, I mean, you can design a whole curriculum around it, but
Mhm.
not from a negative point of view, but from a positive point of view, really. What is, if you're looking at this, well, what are you looking at? If you're
Mm,
looking at a couple or a family, how are you looking at the internal power distributions, the literal power distributions, the what is being conveyed, etc., etc. So there's loads. Yeah, of course, there's loads to do.
yeah, loads more still to work on. And I suppose we're reaching the end actually of my
Great. I mean,
yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude. That's lovely talking with you, but it's tiring talking about oneself so much.
It is, yeah, absolutely. So my last question really is whether you'd give or what advice you might give to feminist or activists entering the field now.
Well, having a political perspective, which is what you're talking about,
Mm,
having a mindset which can grow and change and be affected,
yeah.
and is just really important, and being curious and keeping up with what's going on both in the world around you,
Mm-hmm.
you know and that means not just the Ukraine or Afghanistan and climate change, but really understanding how things like that airplane sitting there waiting for people to go to Rwanda affects people in your practice. I mean, everything affects us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think having a really wide perspective, as well as whatever your sort of interests are, really helps you to be curious and get to know the person that you're sitting with. I know it sounds a bit mad to say go wide, but I think going wide in your own head so that you can do the intricate work of how do they dare risk your caring for them is really interesting. But maybe that's just who I am.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Some really good advice.
And, you know, there's always more to learn. That's what I feel. So it's the most wonderful thing, most wonderful job to have this discipline of sitting with people and letting them hear themselves and letting you hear them.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So important.
Because, you know, therapy is a talking cure, but it's also a listening cure.
I like that. It's nice. Yeah. Okay. So is there anything else that maybe we haven't mentioned that you'd like to touch on around?
Well, there were only one thing, as I sort of, I had a lot of fun doing the In Therapy series on the radio.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Which was, I don't know if you know the history of it, but it was scripted. It wasn't scripted at all. It was spontaneous. The actors talked to the director who invented the story, and so they came in and I just didn't know what I was getting, which was, I got maybe a paragraph.
Ah, okay. That's
and I found that a really interesting. I was trying to give the real feeling of what it's like in the therapy room, but obviously because of confidentiality, I don't think you can really have real people.
Yes.
So anytime I've ever written, I've either invented the people, like in Impossibility of Sex, which were stories from therapy, but the only uninvented person is me, the storyteller, who, and in Therapy, the radio series and the books, it's very much about showing how it feels in the room by creating the ordinary drama and boringness and everything in between that is in therapy. So it was, we you know, the director and I, Ian Rickson, devised this method so that we could bring the surprise of what happens in therapy and then, you know, make it into 15-minute episodes, which is what we did, which means that there are mistakes because you can't edit them out, you know, and I found that was a really interesting project of showing people what it's like to be having a therapy conversation. So I love doing that.
Yeah. Did that feel like a really real experience for you then? Did it feel like a real therapy session for you?
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
You know, and the director would have lots of tricks going on, which I didn't know. They'd tell the person to leave some kind of emotional bomb in the room. And I didn't know that. I didn't know somebody was supposed to, you know, arrive late or lose their keys or have a crush on me or whatever. So all of those things made it like a real therapy.
Yeah.
So I love doing that.
And do you think that had an impact on people, on listeners?
I think it had a huge impact. And the BBC were really great because there are lots of silences in it and they let those silences run.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, huge impact.
Yeah.
And I know it's used in training programs all the time, you know, because you can criticize it or you can say, oh, I don't like what she did there, or, you know.
Yeah, that's a great way to kind of show people, yeah, as you say, a therapy session without it being kind of issues of confidentiality or anything.
Correct.
Yeah. Do you think maybe it, you know, made people feel happier going to, you know, maybe starting therapy, that kind of?
Absolutely. I mean, the number of requests for therapy following it were just phenomenal. I mean,
Oh, really?
I mean, you know, the Women's Therapy Centre started, it was very much in demand, etc., etc. So it's not an unusual thing, but it was just a huge number of people thinking, oh, I want to be listened to like that. I want to hear myself like that.
Gosh. Yeah, that's really great. Lovely. Brilliant.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think that's it. So yeah, just for the record, could you state your gender, please?
Yeah, I'm a woman.
And your place and date of birth.
London, November 6, 1946.
Brilliant. And your occupation?
I'm a psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, and a writer, and an activist.
Lovely.